Welcome to the WTO Trade Dialogues on Food. Welcome to our panelists. Welcome to our viewers. I am Doa Abdelmutal, counselor in the WTO Agriculture and Commodities Division, and I will be your moderator today. I will be putting 2 rounds of questions to our panelists as this webinar proceeds, after which I will be taking questions from the audience. Viewers can send their questions to dialogues@wto.org, and this email address is available on the webinar page for you to consult. I'd like to begin by providing some context for this webinar, which is dedicated to the issue of global value chains in agriculture and food in an era of COVID-19. The world food system has clearly been impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. In these trade dialogues on food, our goal has been to investigate that impact. Our first order of business has been to see and to understand the real impact on the ground. There appears to have been 3 forces at play, forces that were explored in our last webinar of 30 April, and which is available online for you to consult if you've missed it. The first force is a trade policy shock. And what I mean by that is the shock of the trade restrictive measures that we saw in the immediate wake of COVID-19, such as export restrictions on particular foods. There appears to be some good news on this front with countries that have, with some of the countries that have put these restrictions in place now beginning to roll them back. The second shock is what I call the logistical disruption shock. Problems experienced in the mobility of food, of commodities, in the mobility of the inputs to agriculture, such as fertilizer, and in the mobility of farm labor itself due to the lockdowns. Now, we are also increasingly receiving reports of farmers and food industry workers that are themselves falling sick to COVID-19. And it remains to be seen whether this labor shortage begins to constitute a serious supply side constraint and a supply side shock. So we're continuing to monitor the situation. And the third shock that we heard about in the last webinar was the demand shock. And this refers to lower demand for food as a result of the quarantine, the shutdown of restaurants, hotels, bars, cafes, etc. Now, what all agricultural experts seem to tell us is that there is no food shortage today, and that's a very important message. Food exists in abundance. In fact, we have had better crops, a better crop season for certain commodities than we have had in many years. But again, this is a situation that we're continuing to monitor very closely, and we certainly hope that this remains the case. With us today is a distinguished panel of experts from across different geographical regions and different industries to walk us through these issues. So let me introduce our panel to you. With us today is Daniel Njiwa, who is the head of regional food trade in the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa. Caroline Aymon, who is Director General of the International Dairy Federation. Matt Kovac, CEO of Food Industry Asia. Paolo Giordano, Principal Economist of the Inter-American Development Bank. Charlotte Hebebrand, Executive Vice President, Stakeholder Relations, and Chief Sustainability Officer at Nutrien. She is also the former Director General of the International Fertilizer Association. Edwini Kessi, the Director of the WTO Agriculture and Commodities Division. Daniel, let me start with you. Can you describe to us what you are seeing in terms of the impact of COVID-19 on the food system in Africa? The ability of food to move from A to B, and the extent of the disruption to the food value chain that you are seeing?
Thank you, Doa, for the introduction. My name is Adani Onjiwa. I'm representing Agnes Kalibata, a PhD, the president of AGRA, and also the special envoy to the United Nations Director General on Food Systems Summit for next year. So let me start from where you left off, Doa, and I picked two things in your introduction. One, you mentioned that the world, has enough food, and the second part is where you have clearly outlined, the kinds of shocks that are out there from identified from our previous webinar, the trade policy shock, the disruptions around logistics, and the demand shock. I like to add a fourth one, which is a supply shock as well. Why am I picking on these two elements? Number one, I think we need to understand that the African context is quite unique in the sense that experiences we see in the West, experiences we see in the developed world are quite different from our landscape here. The majority of the people, especially in sub-Saharan Africa here, are quite rural based and dependent on agriculture. The African economy is largely agro-based. Others estimate, at least 30% of the GDP. And all of these factors contribute to how the landscape here looks like. And I want to emphasize another point where, AGRA in its analysis has, revealed that quite a significant portion of our businesses in Africa small or medium or micro, which means, most of the food that moves is moved by small businesses and micro businesses, to a large extent also informal. They estimate, in AGRA, we estimate about 64% of all of the businesses that are moving food in Africa, either medium, micro, or small businesses. And these are important facts. Recently also, AFDB estimated that informal cross-border trade is quite significant in Africa. Others speak the trade in informal agriculture products at a minimum of 40%. These factors and these variables speak to why the landscape in Africa is different. And to your question around food systems and the impact of COVID in the region, food systems involves all of these different parts. It involves, resilience. It involves inclusivity. Who is participating? Are women part of the process? The youth part of the process? The small and large businesses? And also looking at issues around nutrition, looking at issues around distribution, food loss, and food waste. So all of these pieces put together really bring about a very unique landscape in Africa. A continent that is currently, in a perennial kind of food deficit, importing quite a large chunk of its food needs. World Bank estimates around, 35 billion every year. So what we are seeing here is an addition to an already really unstable environment or landscape, for lack of a better word. A continent that is always in food deficits year in, year out. And this year, FAO estimates about 700 million people could actually be food insecure. The impact of COVID on the global supply chains, the impact of COVID on regional supply chains, and other decisions that are being taken will obviously make the situation worse. So if you allow me to move quickly to the shocks that you've laid out, the trade policy shock. Yes, at the global level, the argument is there's enough food. FAO estimates maybe 2.3% surplus. But for Africa, the estimates under FAO show that there's going to be a slight deficit. And if you plug into the equation the fact that parts of the region are still in conflict, part of the region experiencing pest infestation, and there's been flooding, there's been droughts in other quarters, the estimate is that to a large extent, Africa will now be looking to import even much more than the average of 35 billion, maybe even towards north of 50 billion. And the COVID situation, stopping or disrupting imports from the global market, will only complicate the situation. But let me come down to a regional level where we're seeing also a different dynamic here. Of course, our governments and regional economic communities, the AU itself, they have all pronounced themselves to keep borders open, at least for essential goods, medicines and food. But if you go on the ground, you still see that there are challenges that are happening out there. Some because of sovereignty in different countries, they are still imposing measures that are still disrupting or at least delaying the flow of goods. One particular example in East Africa is where governments are requesting for transshipments. Or relay kind of driver arrangements where a driver from one country will not be allowed to transport or drive the car with the conveyance into the other country alone because of, for fears of transmission. And these are really valid reasons, but they have an impact on movement of food. And these are things that we need to keep monitoring, and these are things that governments need to constantly engage and see how we resolve these. Otherwise, there's going to be increased deficit. Just the last point, especially on how the food subsystem works in Africa. And unlike other continents, the bulk of the food here comes from small farmers, like I mentioned. And we consume, they produce at least 80% of all the food that we consume. And the logistics, that problems that we see at the higher level are just a signal of what is happening at the lowest level. Many countries have closed village markets. Here in Africa, a village market is equivalent to a gathering of hundreds of people, sometimes. And if you cannot allow these people to converge and come to trade their products, that the value chain at a higher level will also be affected, because there will be no supply coming from these small scale operators. The lack of infrastructure, the lack of information, and the limited structured systems between small farmers and large operators all create this problem in the food space. So I like to stop there, because I know I'll come back later, but at least in my concluding remarks, what I want to say is there is likely going to be a situation where food is not moving, perhaps farmers experiencing low prices, and at the same time, because of loss of jobs, the majority working on a daily basis on wage rates, the demand for food in urban centers reducing, but the food also sometimes, the price is going up. So a paradox that really does not help anyone. Food markets or prices going up, and farmers experiencing depressed prices because they cannot move the volumes they have on hand. So let me stop there. Thank you so much, Doa.
Thank you very much, Daniel. And indeed, we must think about the inequities within the value chain, and we must remember the small farmer as well as the small and medium-sized enterprises, as you say, and not just focus on the bigger players. Caroline, let me turn to you. We would like to know what the disruptions are that you're seeing in the dairy sector. Now, clearly, the sector has been impacted by COVID-19, as have a lot of other food sectors. But we're also hearing reports of global demand for particular types of milk rising in this pandemic. We're hearing about quarantine lifestyles affecting how consumers indulge in baking and cooking, with higher retail sales of cheese, cream, and butter. What is the net impact for the dairy industry, in your view? Can you unmute your microphone, please?
I apologize. Yes, thank you for the opportunity to be with you today. And as you said it, as many sector, the dairy sector is facing this pandemic. First, I'd like to mention that I would say that around the world, both governments and consumer have recognized the essential role of the dairy sector and the dairy product. The governments in several countries around the world have added dairy sector on the list of essential services, and very early in the process. So it means that farmers, milk transport, processing, distribution are still continuing during the pandemic. And that being done with very strict rules in respect of public health to ensure the health of the farmers and the employees through the chain. And from the consumer side, you can say that actually milk remains one of the top food that are bought by people worldwide. And that is explained by the nutritious aspect, the good value that the product is bringing, and also the home meal cooking tradition that we see in different countries. The biggest challenges that we're facing so far are actually to adapt the production and the processing facilities to the transformed demand. And I'm using the word transform because yes, there's a reduction, but there's also a different way where the demand is, and that we need to have the agility to adapt to that. One thing I'd like to clarify, and I know it's cliche, but the reality is that it's a global pandemic, but the intensity of those disruptions are very much local. And Daniel just mentioned it, the situation of Africa is completely different than the situation in Brazil, for example. And I would say that even the intensity and the impact and the solution would be very different even within a country, from one city to another. And that's something that we need to take into consideration, and it's very hard to draw like a full global picture, because the reality is that the impact and the solution are very local. But let me give a shot at those disruptions and see what kind of impact they can have. I would say that one of the first one, and that is facing partly the dairy sector, and I know it's facing other sectors as well, but for the dairy sector is an important one, and is really the suspension of food services. And I'm using the word suspension because it's not permanent. We know the situation is temporary, but it's important enough to disrupt the demand and the supply right now. And by food service, you mentioned around the hotel, the restaurant, but one thing that is important in the dairy sector, it's a school milk program. School milk program around the world are nourishing daily more than 160 million children. We just released a survey of the global situation of school milk program, and the impact is important. It's important for the sector, but it's important for the children. In several countries right now, they're finding very creative solutions to get the milk to the children, even while the schools are suspended. Because for many children, it is the base of their nutrition for the day. So countries are coming up with distribution centers and all kinds of ideas to get the milk when the children need it. So that's an important disruption for our sector. Obviously, the fact that people are cooking more at home and has to adapt the reality to their family cooking, that has an impact on the type of product that the consumer will be buying. But has definitely an impact. We have seen increase in sales of milk, cream, butter, even some yogurt. The cheese category is a bit different because then people will have to adapt. The fine cheese category is facing a different situation. Important element as well is the change in the revenue of many of the consumer. The reality is that several persons have actually lost their job. In some countries, we can take the example of Russia that was already in a financial and economic crisis. On the top of that, they have a pandemic. If we think about the access to food in some country as well, will be impacted by that financial income. So we are actually talking about the risk for nutrition and the hunger in many countries, as Daniel mentioned it. So that's another element we need to take into consideration. The disruption of export market obviously has an impact in the dairy sector. And we see some agility in the processing aspect where actually milk has been transformed into powder, butter, cheese, that could be export later when the market reopens. So that's what we see from some exporting countries. We've been as well seeing a lot of, because we've mentioned that there was a surplus of milk in some country. Now remember that in Northern Hemisphere, it's actually the higher production season right now. So milk has been transformed and donated into dairy products to food bank. And so that's something that we see increasing in several countries, and even government also buying to, because we see people in need because of the financial situation and then food available. So how you connect the two, that's actually something that we see very much. It's also shown us the interconnectivity of our food chain. And that's something you mentioned, the importance of flowing the goods, the people, but that's just the reality of our market right now. the fact that we all interconnected, and sometimes it's internet packages, it's all kind of things that are coming into making the industry a whole. And the last one I wanted to mention is the price to farmer. The world price has been dropping due to the situation. I don't need to explain to economists that when you have surpluses, then price goes down, then price goes down, and farmers' price goes down, and then production will lower. So this kind of a circle, but that's the reality, and it's challenging in several countries. It has to be concerning if we want to maintain farming in some places in the world, that aspect of the price to the farmer, and the need for support for some government at one point to make sure that we still have farmers at the end of this pandemic. I would say the last item in the conclusion will be the fact that those changes and disruption happen all of a sudden. So we needed to react very quickly to adapt to the situation. And I'm very proud of the resilience of our food chain and the sector, because very quickly you've seen all kind of innovation and creativity to get the product to the consumer, all in a safely manner. So I'm actually very impressed to see how we can be resilient in a situation like that.
Thank you very much, Caroline. A lot of messages in what you just said. For me, one of the most important messages is that disruption is local. And indeed, we need to keep that in mind, that the picture is very different in different parts of the world and across different industries. And thank you for mentioning school meals, because I don't think that's mentioned often enough. And that is indeed a big problem, not only in terms of lowering the demand for food, but in terms of nutrition for the youngest generations. Matt, I would like to turn over to you. Now, as CEO of Food Industry Asia, you are CEO of a nonprofit organization that allows food manufacturers across Asia to speak in one voice on a range of issues. So you are very well positioned to tell us what you're seeing across the food industry in the whole of Asia. What can you tell us about the disruption to the agricultural and food value chain that you're seeing, and how serious is the impact?
So good evening. Thank you, Doa. We already have a significant amount of challenges pre-COVID across many parts of Asia. So we have, and these relate to food security. So we had, low availability of arable land, stagnating yields, an aging workforce, massive issues at the farm gate and in storage and transportation on food loss and waste, and sadly, increasing numbers of malnutrition, stunting and wasting and those things. Now, the impact of COVID now is going to actually exacerbate some of those long-term issues, quite frankly. And we also have to contend with those shorter-term issues of COVID, and God forbid, if there is a second wave of COVID towards the end of the year as well. So what we found across many parts of Asia is that, firstly, the agri-food industry wasn't actually considered an essential service or critical infrastructure in some countries. So we already had massive issues with labour shortages due to lockdowns. So sometimes they're called movement control orders. They were called circuit breakers, but for a better word, they were just basically lockdowns. And so you have massive amounts of labour shortage with farms or in manufacturing and processing facilities. And even though there is some capital intensive areas in many parts, and if not most of Asia, it's still heavily reliant on manual labour. And so with those kind of restrictions, immediately you just couldn't get people into a manufacturing site to actually complete the processing. You couldn't get some of the migrant labor to go and pick fruits and vegetables and help with the harvest. So you had massive issues in the top end of the chain, but also simultaneously towards the end of the chain as well. We've also had incidences of input shortages, things like packaging and oils, chemicals, and even electronics. And we found that in some countries and some markets, many of those things were not actually considered essential. So we've had incidences in the beginning, even in Singapore, where some packaging had some restrictions on being brought into the market. It's very small here in Singapore compared with other countries, and it relies on 90% of its imports, and packaging plays an important role in that. So that was one example. I think we've had other examples, perhaps in India, where we've had trucks full of produce or perhaps with more packaged or processed foods that are being able to move across some states and borders, but those empty trucks weren't allowed to come back because they said, well, it's not essential, you don't have the food in it. And this is not a criticism. It was more or less that you have police and local magistrates that are making very, very localized decisions, even more than what Caroline said. She said it's very local. It gets even down into a district level, even more localized. And it was just a lack of understanding and knowledge about food supply chains. It was we've had some similar stories in the Philippines with feed, which again wasn't necessarily considered as essential and wasn't able to be moved, and we had a danger of thousands of poultry that could perish because they weren't getting their feed. But I think what's also happening as well is familiar in other parts of the world is some of the border challenges. And we've seen that in China around the ports in the early days where things were so backed up they couldn't move, that we had enormous problems of being to work through and getting that produce out and food into the markets across China and other places as well. So there's a few of those, few of the big issues. I think Caroline's already mentioned about the food service sector, where basically, yes, there's been a suspension because there isn't a food service sector right now. Demand has completely dropped off. You have a little bit of pockets in certain places in Asia. In Thailand it's a little bit more open. In Mumbai, despite the fact it's a red zone and considered a lockdown, you still have food and beverage outlets open. But in essence, that whole market food services has disappeared for temporarily. And that's created massive issues for farmers in terms of prices, but also issues around food wastage as well. And then also you have consumers, and obviously we're facing some deep economic recessions in many markets across Asia, if not the entire world, and the consumers' ability to pay, but also their willingness and what they can afford to pay for as well. And this will change perhaps over the short term some of those some consumer behaviors. Now, I think that some of the impact that we're seeing across Asia, and I've generalized a little bit here because I know I don't have too much time to speak, means that there will be some long-standing issues beyond this current crisis. And I think that food security is going to be a very highly politically charged issue in certain markets. And we're going to see quite a lot of issues around short-term policy making around stockpiling, and that's happening in some countries within Asia now. Also looking at maintaining and opening and keeping trade open, because across Asia we know that most of the countries rely on imports. Also looking at how countries can digitize and automate as well, considering that we've had these massive impacts from lockdowns, and what potentially technologies we can use to mitigate that in the future. Perhaps other issues around decentralization of production. I think that the food industry, it's not unique, but you have a lot of countries where there's a base of raw materials and unfinished goods, and then they come into the country and then they're processed and finished. But what we might see is a diversification of production. And that might even mean within a country as well, rather than relying on large manufacturing sites, they might diversify more. I think we'll also find quite a bit of diversification of supplier and customer bases to mitigate any future impact from COVID. And hopefully, and this is what we would thoroughly encourage, is an acceleration in investment in automation. There's an enormous amount of economic value that can be captured from automation, and that also means in certain countries mechanization too. And it doesn't mean just cloud computing or data analysts or artificial intelligence or robotics or the Internet of Things. It's basic mechanization as well. And we would hope that also that companies and big multinationals, but also SMEs, would have stronger and closer relationships with smallholder producers, and certainly try to get them significantly more of a stronger voice for them into the food system as well. And certainly helping them with issues around credit, which is always badly needed, as well as microfinance, but also accelerating some of those digital solutions that I talked about as well. So that's sort of a bit of an overview of what's happening across Asia.
Thank you, Matt, for that. Caroline spoke of how sudden the disruption has been. And I think what I see from your statement is also just how complicated that disruption has been so sudden, but very complicated because it's happening across a whole range of areas, from the inability of farmers to find the inputs they need. You spoke about packaging, electronics, etc., to the shortage of labor, to the designation of essential sectors. So it's sudden and very broad ranging. Paolo, let me turn to you. I'd like you to take us to Latin America and the Caribbean. Now, the OECD tells us that the biggest source of growth and driver of growth in the global agricultural value chain is trade across continents and regions rather than trade within regions. And yet it also tells us that the biggest growth in the agricultural value chain that we've seen within a region has been in the Americas. So what can you tell us specifically about disruptions in Latin America and the Caribbean that you're seeing?
Thank you, Noah, and thank you to the WTO for this opportunity. This is a very timely discussion. I would like to start saying that when you think about Latin America, you have to think about heterogeneity. There is not such a thing of Latin America. Latin America is a collection of very different countries. This is true for food security. If you take an index that traces food security across the world, you will find countries in Latin America, mostly the Caribbean countries, but some Central American countries, but mostly the Caribbean countries, in the top 20, in the top most vulnerable countries of the world. At the same time, you will find some countries, particularly countries in South America, that are at the bottom 20, that are the less vulnerable. So I think this is a first point that I think is very important to clarify when we talk about Latin America. Now, when it comes to trade, the same thing applies. You have several countries that are net food importers. You have other, which are those that I already mentioned, that are obviously the most vulnerable. You have some countries that are net food exporters, including big players in global markets like Brazil or Argentina or other countries in South America. And those have been affected in different ways from the demand shock and the supply shock that you mentioned in the introduction. Obviously, all of them have been affected by the logistical shock, which you also talked about. And that is very much true, particularly for intra-regional trade. You mentioned in your question, and it's true, in Latin America, particularly in Central America, about 30% of intra-regional trade is trade in food. So the disruptions of supply chains, beyond the disruptions that we're seeing in supply and demand, and we'll talk more about this, have been very much impacted by the logistical and the customs disruptions. So the first point is about really casting Latin America in a diversity light. The second point is that also this crisis is very much different from what we've seen in 2008 and 2009, which was the last time where the world was concerned about food and food availability. I think you mentioned it earlier at the beginning of your introduction, but we have to realize that this crisis is very different from what we've seen in 2008. The stocks are well supplied, mostly well supplied, and certainly much higher than they were during that crisis. Oil prices are at records low. They were at record high then. This has a huge impact, not only on transport costs, but also on the cost of inputs such as fertilizers. This also, at the time, also had an impact on the financial speculation in commodity prices that obviously we're not seeing now, where we're seeing actually a downward trend in commodities across the world. And also trade policy, which has been mentioned already. At the time, about 30 countries in the world really set up with their trade policies, their beggar the neighbor policies, a food spiral. Right now, the countries that have taken those measures, some of them are in Latin America, are way less, and they are rolling them back, or the instruments that have been taken are not, the quotas mostly are not binding yet. So why I'm saying this? I'm saying this because I think we have to realize that the nature of this crisis, and this is what we're realizing in Latin America, is completely different from what we've seen in the past. Now, how is it impacting our agricultural sectors? For the extensive, capital-intensive, mechanized crops, we're not seeing a lot of disruptions. Those are, and I'm talking about cereals, oil-bearing crops like soybeans. These are, they don't require a lot of people, neither in the production phase, nor they can also, the grains can be loaded and shipped in ports with minimal handling by humans. So the containment measures are not really affecting those sectors. Now, the sectors that where we are seeing disruption are the ones that are more labor intensive, like meat packing, slaughterhouses, meat packing facilities, poultry facilities, the dairy sector, and in general, all the downstream segments of the value chain, more so than the first segments of the value chains. In those cases, we have started to see some disruptions in Latin America. Now, you also have to think about the fact that compared to the other regions, particularly in the advanced economy, but also compared to Asia or to Africa, Latin America is coming late to the pandemic. The pandemic is just starting, has just started a month or so ago in Latin America. Of course, in certain countries is already roaring. This is the case of Brazil, is the case of Ecuador, is the case of other countries that are important not only for food production at the regional level, but also for global supplies. But still, and also there is heterogeneity in the lockdown measures. You have countries like Argentina that have taken very strict lockdowns, and countries like Brazil or Mexico where the lockdowns are much more relaxed. So obviously this translates in different severity of shock in those sectors. Now, where we're seeing a lot of disruption is in the logistic chains, and these tend to affect high value commodities, which tend to and perishable, obviously, which tend to be to a certain extent two overlapping categories. Now we're seeing this because the logistic facility had been disrupted within the countries. International flights are are grounded at 90%, and this is something that people usually don't know, but a lot of the cargo of these commodities actually occurs in passenger flights. Part of the cargo of the passenger flights is actually reserved for berries, flowers, and high value perishable commodities for which consumers in the advanced economies are willing to pay a high price. Now, with the planes not flying or cargo restricted to commercial cargo planes, this has taken a huge toll on those sectors. Now, to the extent, as I was saying, to the extent that the pandemic will develop, we will see probably more impact in Latin America on those sectors. Now, on the demand side, I think there are two major differences as well with the past crisis. The first thing is that this is really a true world crisis. This is something that we haven't seen. Even in World War II, the theater of war was just in a handful of countries. This is something that is happening simultaneously with the same modalities, with different responses, but mostly the only response that we have is stay home in every single country in the world, and is affecting every single person in the world. This is something unprecedented. And so this will probably unleash a recession not seen in the whole century, certainly not in the post-war period. And so the impact through the income side will be huge for the exporter countries in Latin America. So what we're concerned right now is a fall in demand, a sustained fall in demand, and a fall in prices. Now, the other difference is that during the 2008 crisis, the developing world was mostly spared from the crisis. Asia came almost unscathed from the crisis. Latin America as well resisted quite well from the crisis. Right now, those are also parts of the world that are completely immersed in this crisis. So for the net exporters, the risks are very significant. If we put those on the balance, what do we see? We see Caribbean countries very vulnerable. In certain countries, food imports account for several percentage of the GDP. In the case of Haiti, it's 7%. In most of the other countries, we're talking about 3% of the GDP. And obviously, food accounts for a large share of the poorer households. So a food disruption would be certainly damaging for these vulnerable countries. In Central America, we see a mix of risk. Some countries, some risk comes from the demand side, the risk come from the supply side. But what is crucial in Central America is to keep intra-regional trade flowing, and we see there have been some disruptions. And finally, in South America, as I said, is certainly a global demand risk. My last point is that I think looking at a crisis as an opportunity talks to the importance of keeping the WTO alive and keeping world food market open, not only for the importance of this during this crisis, but also for the recovery thereafter.
Thank you very much, Paolo. A lot of messages there. First of all, that the labor-intensive sectors are more affected, the higher value commodities, the perishables are more affected, and so on. And we appreciate, of course, that there are lots of differences between countries in your region, and that the pandemic is coming late to them. Thank you for those comments. Charlotte, let me move over to you. Now, global food security relies on our ability to trade in food, but clearly also in our ability to trade in agricultural inputs and on well-functioning distribution systems. So what risks does COVID-19 pose in this regard, and in particular when it comes to plant nutrition?
Thank you, Doa, very much for inviting me to this very important discussion. As you mentioned in your introduction, I have just ended my tenure as the Director General of the International Fertilizer Association, and have just begun a new job with Nutrien. Nutrien is a Canadian-based company. It is actually the world's largest provider of crop inputs, services, and solutions, and plays a critical role in feeding the future by helping growers around the world to increase food production in a sustainable manner. So when we talk about trade, I think we can't emphasize enough how vital it is for ensuring food security. And if you look at crops, for example, and you may have covered this in your first webinar, if you look at 2019 data, looking at the major crops, so that would be corn, wheat, soybeans, rice, barley, in total, 20% of those crops are actually traded across borders. It differs for each one of those crops. Soybeans, as much as 45% of total soybeans produced are actually traded. Rice is lower, about 7% of rice production is exported. Now, when we look at fertilizers, those numbers actually go up even higher. So you may know that there are three macronutrients, nitrogen, phosphate, and potash, which are very crucial for crops to be able to grow. And again, looking at 2019 data, if you take all of those combined, some 45% of those products produced are traded across borders. And the numbers are even more striking when you look at the individual nutrients. So taking potash, for example, some 78% of potash produced was traded in 2019. That is a very, very high number. And considering how important fertilizers are for food production, we know that fertilizers are responsible for about 50% of crop yields. So it's just to reiterate that trade is really very vital. Now, why, might you ask, is such a high percentage of fertilizer production traded? Well, the answer is quite simple. And that is that fertilizers tend to be produced in regions where you find raw materials that are required for their production. So that would be potash and phosphate ore. Those are both products that are mined and then turned into fertilizers. And then it's also natural gas or coal for the production of nitrogen. So trade is clear, open trade is clearly crucial, both for food and fertilizers, but so of course is distribution and transportation. And I think all of the panelists have touched on this very well. Fertilizers, thankfully, were also designated by many countries as an essential or critical product, therefore facilitating their movement both across borders, but also within countries. But nonetheless, of course, there are challenges. And again, the other panelists have outlined some of those challenges, and they apply equally to the fertilizer sector. I think we're still, to be honest, in early days. We don't quite know the full impact of some of these disruptions yet. It's very important to track these extremely carefully because we are talking about the food supply. And I just want to go back to Daniel's point about the specificity here of sub-Saharan Africa, and that applies also in the fertilizer sector. So we know that in recent years, African farmers have actually finally been able to increase some their fertilizer use. They're still way beyond the sort of international average fertilizer use, but it has increased. And yet we do see that the COVID crisis might have a dampening effect on that. So there are some institutions like the International Fertilizer Development Center and the African Fertilizer Agri-Business Partnership that are trying already to survey farmers and agro-dealers in Africa. And the results of those surveys are already somewhat disconcerting. So we have heard about lack of access to inputs. We've heard about rising prices at the local level. We've heard about difficulties getting farmers into the fields, accessing output markets. So I think, again, echoing what Daniel has said, very, very important here, I think, to pay specific attention to what will happen both to access to inputs, but then also the ability of African farmers to be able to produce in the months ahead. So I'll stop there for this first round.
Thank you very much, Charlotte. So clearly, global food security depends not just on food being able to move, but plant nutrients being able to move as well. And thank you for mentioning that 45% of the world's fertilizer is traded on international markets. Edwini, I'd like to turn to you. There's news that the trade shock that I described in my introductory remarks is receding. What can you tell us about the rollback of trade restrictive measures? Also, how does the global agricultural value chain contribute to the strength and resilience of our food system?
Thank you, Doa. Let me start with the second part of your question. First, i.e. the importance of the global food and agricultural value chain. There is no doubt that our food systems are more integrated than ever before. They are integrated in two principal ways. First, in that the food produced at one end of the globe can be feeding someone at the opposite end. And we spoke about that at length in the last webinar. International trade today feeds 1 in every 6 persons, and over 30 countries could face starvation in the absence of international trade in food. Thus, trade in food is not a luxury, but a necessity. Second, our food systems are integrated in that our food production process itself takes place across many different locations within a country, as well as across countries. And I would like to make this very visual for the viewers with a product that most people cherish, that is chocolate. Most people don't realize the number of countries involved, for example, in the production of a bar of chocolate. West African countries, particularly Cote d'Ivoire and my own country, Ghana, are the leading producers of cocoa today, accounting for around 60% of world cocoa supply. The milk that goes into chocolate, for example, comes from different countries, such as New Zealand, Germany, the Netherlands, and the United States. In a bar of chocolate, we also find sugar and various additives and flavorings, which themselves are sourced from around the world. Among the world's top sugar exporting countries are Brazil, Thailand, India, France, and Guatemala. And I'll spare you the details on hazelnuts and raisins, which would also come from a different set of countries. Not to mention that when that bar of chocolate is finally assembled, and I stress the word assembled, it needs packaging and marketing, transportation and retail sale. All of these goods and services also come from different locations. So the reality is that a bar of chocolate is not made in any single country, but it is actually made in the world, given the various contributions or the various parts in the production process that different countries contribute to. And that does not stop only with chocolate, but to many other foods. Absolutely, all continents today engage in the import and export of food, as well as in the inputs as well. I mean by this, the farm equipment, tractors, seeds, fertilizer, and everything else. So we are extremely interdependent. In addition, the agricultural value chain or the global food assembly process will not be possible without trade in services. Currently, trade in services account for about 40% of world trade, and that underlines the growing importance of trade in services. It is the main employer in many countries and also the main source of foreign exchange, whether in the field of tourism and in other services sectors. Food will be of no use to anyone if not transported through transportation services, marketed through marketing services, sold through retail outlets, and so on. The value of international trade in food has tripled since the year 2000. It now accounts for about $1.5 trillion. Developing countries have significantly expanded their share of agricultural export markets, and this has played a very crucial role in pulling their farmers and rural areas out of poverty. So in short, the agriculture and food value chain is critical to food systems, and we have to do everything to support it. Now, let me turn to the first part of your question, the rollback of trade restrictions. Yes, I'm pleased to say that there are signs that some of the trade restrictions that came into being in the immediate aftermath of COVID-19 are being rolled back. We saw that immediately after the crisis, the imposition of various export restrictions on food, in particular on wheat and rice. This was an attempt by countries to respond to uncertainty and also to guarantee their own food security. Of the 17 countries that sought to limit food exports to protect their domestic market, about half have now rolled back the measures, according to an international tracker from the International Food Policy Research Institute, IFPRI. This includes several major grain shippers, such as Vietnam and Romania. So these are positive signs, and we certainly hope that the effort to keep food flowing continues as per the recommendations of the G20. Daniel underscored that we have abundant supplies, and this is very different from the situation in 2008, when at the height of the global financial crisis. I'd like to point out that we have also seen trade facilitating measures as well in response to COVID-19, and that not everything has been about restricting trade. A week ago, 49 countries, WTO members, pledged to support open and predictable trade in food and agricultural products and not to disrupt food supply chains. This initiative was led by Canada, and we now have about 5 or so countries which have joined in the last week. So it's very encouraging that the WTO members also see the importance to keep trade open, because trade, as I had mentioned, feeds about 1 out of 6 people. Trade is indispensable if we are to ensure that the pandemic does not create another crisis, i.e. food crisis. These countries, as I said, the Canadian initiative now account for about 65% of global exports of food and agricultural products and about 55% of global imports. On the SPS front, many of the emergency notifications filed by countries had to do with facilitating trade, moving to electronic certification to cut time and to reduce transaction costs, import and health and safety checks. So I think it would be wonderful if that process of digitalization were to continue post-COVID-19 because of the obvious benefits to the agricultural sector. So I think I'll just pause here, Dora.
Thank you very much, Edwini. And indeed, very interesting to hear you say that a bar of chocolate is assembled in the world. Most of our viewers would not think of a bar of chocolate as sourcing its ingredients from across the globe. And indeed, the ingredients are sourced from pretty much everywhere. Which shows us the importance of international trade for food. Let me now come to the second round of questions, and I would ask our panelists to be very brief since we're running a little behind time, and so that we have time to take a few questions from our viewers. Daniel, let me come to you. I'd like to go to the issue of food security in Africa and rising levels of poverty in Africa and everywhere, in fact, in the wake of COVID-19. What do those rising levels of poverty tell us about access to food in Africa at the moment and the possibility of increased hunger? A little known fact, a little discussed fact about the Ebola crisis is the fact that it also led to a food security crisis. It was not only a health crisis, but very much a food security crisis too. What can you tell us, Daniel?
Thanks again. That's a very good observation, and I think we are looking forward to really a tricky situation in the next few months or weeks, especially when some of the decisions that need to be taken are not taken. I like to interpret access to food in a number of ways. One is, could we ask ourselves the question of whether the food itself is available? And I think we explored that earlier, that disruptions at the global market may slow, imports into the region, but also the region is already, facing a number of calamities, including climate issues and all that affecting availability of food. The COVID has just, worsened the situation now, where we're seeing really flow of inputs in areas that are going into production now, like in West Africa, being disrupted because of closure of markets or movement of persons. In parts of the region, Southern Africa and maybe a bit of East Africa, they are now harvesting and perhaps they will have that food. But also, this brings us to the next issue of whether this food is now being fully distributed. And we've also explored that to see that distribution is also being impacted by the COVID. Although the measures that have been put and policies by governments to open trade, the reality is many of the people that are involved in moving some of this food that we eat, we consume here, 80% in primary actually form, are not really involved in these kind of measures, and they are basically people and businesses that move with their food. So you cannot move the food without the person himself, and restrictions on persons means restrictions on the movement of people. So those are some of the problems. The other issue is affordability. Are they able to access the food and afford it? The loss of jobs, the daily wage jobs that we're experiencing because of closure of companies, the tourism industry almost shut down, means that people have little disposable income to afford the food. Part of that also is because of the cost is going to be going up. I want to also speak to the point of nutrition. What we are seeing here is that because of these disruptions and lack of infrastructure, a lot of our perishables and nutrition-dense foods, fruits and vegetables, will pretty much go to waste, and we will not reach the people that need it, and this could have really serious nutrition impacts. I wanted to move quickly to what then needs to happen, and perhaps starting with our organization, what we are doing is, to engage our governments, because the biggest factor that we need at this point addressed is the ability of governments to have better insights of what is going to happen next week, what's going to happen in the next 2 months, and this is an area of generating enough data and evidence to inform those choices, and we have started some of this work in some countries, consolidating data on a more real-time basis to inform decisions around food access and food availability. The other issue that I think needs to happen quickly is to see how best do we engage into like social protection measures, food distribution or cash for jobs in order to get people, the ability to afford and access this food. On the part of governments, some of them have already started, rolling out their strategic grain reserves. Those that had stock have started distributions, but we are seeing other countries that really don't have stock as we speak now. Even at the regional level, in ECOWAS, I think they only have a month supply or less of food at their regional strategic grain reserve. So we need to look at measures that help bring some humanitarian assistance to these strategic grain reserves. Matt and others also mentioned issues about digitalizing and automating some of our commerce and business to improve access. If we can't allow people to move into village markets or convene and move their products, how do we consolidate some of these produce, some of this food to easily be delivered to the people that need it using digital solutions? Lastly, I wanted to mention that I think we shouldn't lose the bigger picture in terms of the long-term vision. And I think given the landscape that we're seeing here, we have to do everything we could to bring more inclusive systems, more inclusive structured market systems that bring on board small, informal, semi-formal operators into the food value chain. Otherwise, we're missing a big picture here. And I think the opportunity we have at our hands now is the launch of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, which is going to be in effect in a couple of months. I think the launch was expected in 2 months' time, but maybe there'll be some delays because of the COVID. But this is also another window that we could look at. And also, the last point that I want to mention is about infrastructure. I mean, we are talking about people, 70% of our farmers who produce 80% of what we eat, sitting in remote areas and failing to channel these products to the market in the most efficient way possible. How do we start now to look backwards and invest in regional, internally facing regional infrastructure, rather than just building on infrastructure that feeds into the global markets for that matter, and forget our internal measures? I want to stop at a point where we want to also help improve policy predictability. I think it really speaks a lot to how much our private sector will be investing in the sector. If they are sure of what will happen in the next couple of months, if they know what government positions will be in the next few weeks, they are able to make those decisions. Similarly, farmers make those decisions based on some of these measures. So policy predictability is where I want to end with my intervention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Caroline, let me move over to you. We hear that new habits are forming as a result of the crisis, new consumer consumption behavior, new shopping behavior, new ways of doing business with more online sales, for instance. What are you seeing on the dairy industry side, and are there any changes that are likely to stay with us for the long haul?
Thank you, Doha. First, I would say for the consumer behavior, it's a bit too early to talk about new habits. The behavior we saw on week first of the pandemic, like for example, stocking long shelf milk, has already disappeared in week 8 of the pandemic. So back to more normal behavior. So it will take a while before we can really evaluate that. So we are obviously collecting data and survey right now. And if we do another webinar in 6 months, maybe we'll have a clearer view. But obviously the impact of cooking at home and the pleasure, the connection with the farmers, those are things we can expect will stick longer. Regarding the shopping behavior, obviously the dairy sector has been very known to be dynamic and innovative, and to find all kind of agility and flexibility to get the product to the consumer. And this trend of online shopping is not new. It was there before the pandemic, but this is just for part of the world. For the rest of the world, actually, the buying and selling is very different, and we have very innovative approach. For example, if you are in China, you can actually get a bottle of fresh milk delivered to your door, and it's for hundreds of thousands of people in Beijing that actually can get those milk bottles at their door every day. In India, people will go to cooperative, the local cooperative, they have a shop at almost every corner where they can buy fresh milk and dairy products. So the sector is adapting to the need of the consumer, and that will continue post-pandemic. So what will really stick in terms of online, it will have impact in some country, but we see more growing in terms of contact between the farmers directly and processing, small processor, and the consumer. So a change retail approach. I wanted to talk a little bit about the role of government. We just mentioned, and Matthew mentioned, the complexity of the food chain. And regulators and policymakers sometimes are not completely fully aware of that complexity. So it is important to rely on experts, on scientists, so they can help them building the best policies that are based on science, experience, and facts. Obviously, the government also has a role, to make sure that the system adapts. And we've talked about an unprecedented situation, exceptional situation, where in that case, the government needs to be there to support the sector. And it's just a reality if we want to make sure that we can support the food system afterwards. I've talked earlier about the donation, the food donation, the creation of food bank. That can also give ideas to government around the world to try to maybe structure a bit. In the past, we see a lot in the dairy sector from the farmers, as well as the processing plant to give donation to food bank. It's something that's very common in regular time. But I think for government to think about how they could actually integrate that aspect of food bank donation of product that are manufactured, that's also something that we hope in the future, that's an idea that could stick. I'd like to end maybe with that comment about the fact that dairy is an engine in the rural and national economy around the world. And it's a strong contributor to food security, to address hunger and malnutrition, and to contribute to other UN SDGs. So our role is really to nourish the world with safe and sustainable dairy, and we'll continue to do so during and post-pandemic. And for those in the audience who would like to learn a bit more about specific information about dairy, you can go on our website on International Dairy Federation. We actually have a resource center on COVID-19 in the dairy sector. We also have a newest publication on the World Dairy Situation Report 2020, where we have all the market data, production, price, trade, consumption, and we also have a Global Marketing Trends 2020 that we just published as well. So you can find all that information on our website. And obviously contact us if you do have any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline. Matt, let me move over to you. A similar question to the one I've just asked Caroline. Are you seeing a change in consumption behavior, shopping behavior, and business practices in Asia as a result of COVID-19? And are some likely to stay for the long haul?
Okay, so I'll probably frame this rather than actual behavioural change. It's just a little bit of consumer behaviour or consumer insight, because we don't know whether long term it's fundamentally going to change. But there's a couple of key things in terms of actual shopping habits. E-commerce for groceries exploded, and it was actually a very small percentage of the overall e-commerce pie in Asia, even though e-commerce in general in Asia is quite sophisticated now. And so we've seen a massive uplift in that, and that's simply because people were in lockdown, and there were certain restrictions of going into retail environments. So it's only natural that many people turn to e-commerce to try and be fulfilled. We don't know if that's actually going to be a long-term trend, although some people are saying it is, but there's a significant portion of consumers that couldn't be fulfilled through e-commerce because the demand was simply too high. And one of them was me. I still can't get an e-commerce delivery for the last 4 or 5 weeks being stuck at home. So it would be interesting to see if that really does change some behaviors. The other one is also convenience stores. In certain markets around Asia, many of the wet markets were closed as well, and people turned to convenience stores for a lot of their fresh including dairy actually, and some other things are around fresh produce like fruits and even some vegetables, even though in a convenience store, they're usually a higher price anyway. And so we saw a bit of that. I'll give you an example. In China, we've obviously the economy starting to open up. And so there's some changes there. And I think what we saw was during COVID as well, there was, while people wanted to be healthy and buying fresh fruit and looking for immunity boosting local sort of Chinese medicines and things, they also still wanted a lot of indulgence. And there was a significant uplift in the purchasing habits around snacks and sweets. And we've done some research on China. It's at a baseline from March 2019, and it was up about 250% during COVID. And that's come back a bit as the economy's opened up, as the lockdowns have eased and the economies have opened up, but it's still at around 150%. And I guess people just needed some comfort food doing that. And it'll be interesting to see if that stays. And then you had some other markets as well that threw up some interesting findings. So, for example, in Indonesia, which is still going through COVID, and it's still part of the country's in lockdown as well, although it has been eased a bit during Ramadan, that we saw people looking for natural remedies to boost their immunity. And so we saw, rather than drinking teas and coffees, which are rather popular in Indonesia, we saw a move to the jamu, which is a traditional herbal drinks as well. But also it's pushed up the prices of turmeric because people want to use that a lot in their beverages because they think that's immunity boosting too. Some similar findings, I think, also in Thailand and the Philippines, although for the Philippines, when it came to actual consumer purchasing habits, food safety was a number 3 priority. So you had health and price, but also number 3 was food safety. And what that meant was that many consumers were looking for more reliable, traditional, famous brands, not necessarily international ones, but some of the bigger domestic brands, because they trusted them to be safe. And when we sort of inquired a little bit more around that, and it's also perhaps some of the misinformation around COVID, and saying that food was contaminated, and that could be a passer on of COVID-19, and perhaps that's what consumers were reading and making their purchasing habits on. And then for places like Thailand, a big focus is still on taste. And they won't compromise taste, even with health and price. And so comfort foods have shot up, but then in tune with that, so is massive consumer concerns about weight gain. But obviously, if you're consuming too many comfort foods, then perhaps that's the case. And finally, across a few of those markets, one interesting finding was actually on packaging. And it was looking at how consumers were looking at plastics as being more useful, in the sense that they didn't want to take their own bags into retail environments, or when they were getting groceries online, it was, can you put that into plastic? And looking at small size packaging of plastic because of storage issues, particularly in big urban areas in China, but also in places around Bangkok as well. The negative side of that is the increased use in single-use plastics, okay? And that is going to be a major problem. And even with ordering online in certain markets where you're able to do food delivery, and the amount of single-use plastics that are used with that. And we have to be mindful that given where oil prices are, and that virgin plastic is going to be cheaper than what it was before, and the market for recyclables has just fallen away because it's just cost too much, and it's cheaper to produce virgin plastics, that we still need to focus very much on reducing those single use. And we don't know how long COVID will continue. And I think one of the business practices out of that is interesting, is that from many companies now, and including us at FIA, we're actually asking for some regulation, particularly on food contact materials, so that many of those contaminated food packaging can go through a specific process, so it could be recycled and back into the food chain. Because if this does linger and continue, then the amount of waste around that is going to be huge, as is food waste too. Okay, so I think I'll probably leave it there.
Thank you very much. Paolo, let me move over to you. The services sector is critical for the growth of global agricultural value chains. Trade services such as hotels, restaurants, retail, transportation services, financial and business services. Without them, we cannot have an agricultural value chain. How resilient are the services sector, these particular sectors, in this crisis?
That's an excellent question, Doa. When you look at it through Latin America, think about that services are really dominated by tourism. In most countries, more than 60% of services exports are tourism. So that's going to be huge. And that's going to be huge, particularly in the Caribbean islands, which are already vulnerable to food security, which rely hugely on tourism. And I think here the point is that not only, obviously, tourism is ground to zero right now, but probably the propensity to travel after the crisis is going to be completely changed from what we've seen in the past. So we have here a major structural change that will affect our. Now, the second services export item is transport. And here, let me speak about trade policy, because I spoke earlier on how important it is for certain categories of food products. But I think Edwini spoke about the commitments that are undertaken at the WTO, and Latin American governments have been very vocal and participated in that. Now they make sure that the reality on the ground lives up to the commitments. And it seems to me that trade policy can do more than do no harm. Through trade facilitation, there are a lot of practical things that governments can do in order to make transport flow better. Customs cooperation in order to clear expeditiously food items. Expedited licensing and certification for sanitary phytosanitary standards. This is something just a matter of political will and putting people together and do it. Non-intensive mechanism for the fast release of goods. Perishable goods stay at the customs and lose value if those are not implemented. Working with the private sector, authorized economic operators, for instance, or reliable or frequent importer and exporter. They should have a green channel in order to move through customs in the quickest possible way. And I think, and it's my last point, looking at what is going to come and what we're learning from this crisis is that, and some Latin American countries are doing, we really have to think about coordinated border management, where governments harness the power of technology and set up cooperation protocols among customs to really make customs like a point of trade facilitation rather than a choke point, which is happening right now.
Thank you very much. Charlotte, let me turn to you. Now, in our first webinar, one of the main conclusions was that we are not facing a food shortage and that there is a sufficient supply of food. Would you still agree with this assessment?
Yes, absolutely. I think today that is the case. I think the biggest shock, as has been said earlier, has been the logistical shock. And so we all need to be very careful that governments, as well as all the players in the value chain, take care to minimize that logistical shock as much as possible. Let me talk about another shock, though, and that's the economic shock. And we're probably just at the cusp of really seeing the full impacts of the crisis on economies. The IMF recently announced that more than 100 countries are likely to see negative GDP growth as a result of this crisis. We know that poverty over time, regardless of how good the food supply is the major contributor to food insecurity around the world. And we've had we've seen great progress in the last few decades in decreasing the number of hungry around the world. But since 2015, that number has actually gone up, unfortunately. Today, we have 820 million people around the world that are malnourished. And I am very concerned that the economic impact of COVID is likely to drive that number much higher, making it really more difficult for us to reach the goal of zero hunger by 2030. I think the other thing to keep in mind is that we have price shocks that are always a possibility, right? So, sorry, just to go back to poverty, one other quick point to make about poverty, as you may know, most of the world's poor actually live in rural areas. So, and 2 out of the 3 people in extreme poverty are living in rural areas. Agriculture remains the foremost driver to get people out of poverty. So very, very important, I think, for farmers both to have access to inputs and access to output markets if we're going to, again, meet the goal of no hunger and zero poverty. So now let me quickly go to the potential for shocks. So yes, right now we have a comfortable food supply. We have still quite comfortable stock-to-use ratios. But let's not forget that a major negative weather event in one region, or if we see an uptick in trade restrictions occur, that can very quickly change a situation and lead to very, very big increases in food prices, which of course have the biggest impact, again, on the world's poor. And then lastly, let me say that whereas today we may feel quite comfortable with the food supply, that is not something that I take for granted. And we know that in the run up to 2050, the FAO and others have said we're likely to see an increase in food demand of around 60%. Now, and that's not the only challenge. We also have to increase agricultural production in a way that is more sustainable, because we know that the environmental footprint of agriculture needs to shrink if we are to remain within the targets set by the Paris Agreement of limiting the worst impacts of climate change to a 2-degree increase in temperature or below. So the big challenge here will be to increase the food supply, but to do it in a sustainable manner. And that is really where Nutrien is very, very engaged in those efforts. Thank you.
Thank you. Edwini, let me turn to you. There is a perception that the only set of rules in the WTO rulebook that are relevant to agriculture are the rules of the Agreement on Agriculture. But as we know, global value chains cannot survive without trade in services and industrial products, etc. What can you tell us about how the entirety of the WTO rulebook supports agricultural value chains?
Thank you, Doa. I'll say that the entire WTO rulebook is relevant to trade in agriculture, commodities, and food, and that it would be erroneous to think or to focus only on the agreement on agriculture. Clearly, that agreement plays an important role, and it is my expectation that it would actually play a bigger role in the future, considering that members are currently engaged in negotiations to try to strengthen the agreement after the between 20 to 25 years of experience. So I think it would play a greater role in the years ahead. However, it is not only that agreement which is important. There are other agreements like the SPS agreement, TBT agreement, and I would address this in a couple of minutes. Another thing which we also need to bear in mind is the fact that, for example, if you look at many African countries, as a result of tariff escalation, they only produce primary products like, for example, if coming back to the example of cocoa, many African countries, Cote d'Ivoire, Ghana, they still export the raw cocoa beans. And what you find is that when they export the raw cocoa beans, there will be no tariffs, but if it is processed into, let's say, cocoa powder, then they begin to face tariff barriers. And this is what prevents many African countries from adding value to their raw materials. And this actually deepens poverty in these countries. So tariff escalation is one of the important things that the WTO we are trying to address in the ongoing negotiations. And addressing this problem will do a whole lot in terms of enhancing the participation of developing countries in food and agricultural value chain. But as I mentioned, this is only one agreement. It will be futile, for example, to liberalize trade only in food while restricting trade in inputs or farming equipment, which makes the food production possible. Likewise, it will also be futile to restrict trade in services that support agricultural value chain. We all know that transportation, marketing, and retail, all of them play a key role. Similarly, it will be also important also to protect intellectual property, which goes into innovation. If that is not protected, then obviously it would discourage innovation, and we will know that it would affect the diversity of food products that we are all now accustomed to. Likewise, also standards are very important, and I would like to dwell on the two important agreements that we have here at the WTO, the SPS agreement and the TBT agreement. Both agreements recognize the right of countries to impose measures, but they shouldn't restrict trade. And I think that's very important as far as the global value chains are concerned. So in short, most WTO agreements are relevant to trade in agriculture and food, and also to support global value chains as far as agriculture is concerned. And that is not it. We also have the Trade Facilitation Agreement, which entered into force in 2017, which sets multilateral rules for reducing red tape that reduces the speed and efficiency of border procedures. Trade facilitation, as we all know, is very critical for agricultural pressure, as some of our colleagues have said this afternoon. Perishable products is very important for them to get to the market. And if you have cumbersome custom procedures, definitely that would impact negatively on trade. This brings me to one of, one other important initiative, which is currently the WTO members are focusing on, and that is e-commerce. I think we would all concur that COVID-19 has been a quantum leap into the digital area. Many of us are now buying most of our food and services online. In December last year, WTO members agreed to extend a moratorium on custom duties on e-commerce transmissions. In addition, over 80 members have joined hands to create a joint initiative on e-commerce in which they will look at ways at promoting online trade. The digital era, of course, is also supported by the WTO Information Technology Agreement, whose product and membership coverage we all know were expanded in Nairobi during the Nairobi Ministerial Conference in 2017. Its participants are committed to eliminating tariffs on IT products covered by that agreement. So as I said at the outset, I think it would be erroneous only to focus on the agreement on agriculture, but you have the WTO rulebook has to, all of the WTO rulebook is important, and I think all of them support agricultural value chains. So I think I'll just stop here, Doa.
Thank you very much, Edwini. We are running a bit late. We can go over time. The closing time for this webinar was 3:30, but I think we can stay a little bit longer just to take at least one round of questions from our viewers. And I would ask you all to be very, very brief in your responses. Caroline, a question to you is on the role of science in regulations. What does COVID-19 tell us about the importance of science?
Yes, and indeed, it is critical, and it's interesting to see that actually scientists now are becoming the new sexy, and it's good because we have kind of lost a little bit of sight of the importance of science-based and research in decision making, and that's what COVID-19 is showing us actually. Is the importance of relying on that collaboration as well of scientists that we see around the world. And that makes it stronger because we're taking all expertise around the world and making something that we can all rely on. And this is very important in times like this.
Thank you. Charlotte, a question from viewers on the price of fertilizer. Are we likely to see prices skyrocket in the wake of this crisis?
No. I think we're in a quite good space right now. There's ample supply of fertilizers. There's good capacity. So I would not expect to see any price spikes. Now, having said that, it is possible that maybe at the local or regional levels, if there are real difficulties in distribution and transportation, then you may see price increases in different geographies. But at the global level, we do not see any problems, certainly this year or even the next years ahead.
Thank you. Matt, a question from a viewer on storage facilities. This crisis has shown that food can very easily go to waste when there are logistical disruptions. Is there any attention being given to increasing storage facilities and improving them in Asia?
Sadly, probably not as much focus on that there should be right now. But going forward, I think given the pressures of some markets that are going to look at putting in some policies around stockpiling and then using bigger storage facilities, then yeah, the issue around storage and food waste will have to be addressed. But it continues to be a bit of a bugbear across many parts of Asia.
Thank you. Daniel, a viewer is asking whether you are optimistic or pessimistic about the African Continental Free Trade Agreement.
Hi, short answer is I am optimistic. We will be, the launch of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area will obviously expand the market beyond what is currently, happening now. We have a few regional economic communities that have similar frameworks as the one promoted at the continental level. But we believe that by expanding the geography, 50 plus countries, that market widens and creates incentives for even higher investments in the agriculture sector that we so much need. So I'm very optimistic this thing will come up and it will do good to our farmers, our small businesses, and the economies of Africa at large. Thanks.
Paulo, a question from a viewer in Latin America. Is this crisis likely to take Latin American agriculture more in the direction of digitalization? Is it likely to give digitalization?
It's a very good question. I think digitalization will do a lot, both for businesses and for governments. I was listening the other day, like an operator of the digital economy that told me that in Argentina, they've done more in these last 20 days than what they've done in the last 2 years in terms of digital trade. So this crisis has accelerated digital progress a lot. Now, there is a limit on how much this will impact the food sector if you think that the poor will not be able to rely so much on the digital delivery of food. Now, governments can use it a lot, like electronic single windows, interoperability of electronic single windows, the application of artificial intelligence to risk management. These are all things related to technology that governments can do in order to make trade flow better.
Thank you. Edwini, a question from a viewer. What are the lessons learned for the WTO from the COVID-19 crisis?
I think one lesson learned is that transparency is very important. And I think the WTO should enhance its transparency mechanisms, the monitoring mechanism, because as we have seen, although there are abundant food supplies, but there is the misperception that food supplies or food is, there is shortage of food. So having transparency, encouraging the members to promptly notify their measures, I think if we were to do that, then a lot of countries may not have imposed export restrictions. So I think we need to make sure that transparency is enhanced. And also I think an important thing for the WTO to do is also to try to move ahead in the negotiations. For example, we have seen that there are still so many distortions. If we were to have an agreement which would level the playing field, I think it would enhance production and there wouldn't be the need for restrictive measures. So I think these are the two key lessons that the WTO must learn from this crisis.
Thank you very much. So with this, we have come to a close. I'd like to thank our panelists on behalf of the WTO and on behalf of our viewers for what I think has been an incredibly informative webinar. So thank you very much and please stay safe. Goodbye.